Let's take a look at y equals tangent of x again. Again, if we're going from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2, and we're choosing these values so that your final graph will be one smooth curve instead of two disjointed curves, we would get the following, right? Remember, circ or tix, tangent is y over x. We get undefined, negative 1, 0, 1, and undefined. So unlike sine and cosine functions, which the period is 2 pi over b, so remember period tells you how long one cycle is, right? And it's periodic, meaning it repeats itself every 2 pi units for the parent function. For tangent and cotangent functions, it's periodic every pi, or pi over absolute value of b if you have a b value. So here's how I would go about doing this. So I notice here that I have y equals tangent of x. My period is going to be pi over b, where my b value is just 1. So my period's pi. And then my increment, I'm going to go ahead and divide by 4 just to keep it consistent with all the other graphs. So I'm starting at 0 here since I don't have any phase shifts. And I'm going to go pi over 4. I'm going to add 1 to the right. And then if I add pi over 4 to that pi over 4, I get 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. Again, you can leave it as 2 pi over 4. You will still get full credit if you do that. And so tangent graph is the only one where you do 2 to the right and 2 to the left. So cotangent, you're going to do 4 to the right, same thing with sine and cosine. But for tangent, you're going to do 2 left, 2 right. And then you mirror it, right? You're going to the left. So negative pi over 4 and negative pi over 2. The reason we do this is so we can get a nice smooth graph instead of like two disjointed ones. So instead of having like part of a graph looking like so, right? We want one smooth graph. Okay, so let's look at the end points or the end values of our little section here, of our little period. We have undefined, so at negative pi over 2 and positive pi over 2, we get undefined. A 0, 0 in the middle. And negative pi over 4, negative 1. So I'm going to go put negative 1 there. And positive pi over 4, comma 1. Remember, the a value rule still applies. So whatever that a value is here, it's going to go up on the y-axis and down here on the y-axis as well. So when I connect this all together, right, remember you're going to do concave up for one of them and concave down for one of them. There is my final graph. You want to remember this basic shape. Remember that you have vertical asymptotes on either ends. You have the x-intercept in the center, and then you have a value to the right going up a, and then to the left going down a. So it's a positive graph, or it's an increasing graph from left to right. If I had y equals negative tangent of x, if I had that negative out in front, that would make it a vertical reflection over the x-axis. So what type of a graph would that give you, right? All the points would be reflected, right? So it would give you, on the left-hand side here, concave up. And then on the right-hand side, concave down. So from left to right, notice that it would be a decreasing graph. Let's take a look at the cotangent graph. So if I have y equals cotangent of x, remember cotangent is a reciprocal of tangent, so instead of tix, I'm going to have x over y. For cotangent, we're going from 0 to pi. So that gives me undefined, 1, 0, negative 1, and undefined. So I've made a table of those values here. So when I went ahead and labeled the x-axis here, notice that they're going every pi over 4 units. Let's go ahead and see the end values are undefined here. Okay, and I have my pi over 2 comma 0, pi over 4 comma 1, and 3 pi over 4 comma negative 1. So you're going to do the same type of a shape, concave up here and concave down. Notice that a positive cotangent of x is a decreasing graph. From left to right, it is decreasing, which means a negative cotangent graph, right? Y equals negative cotangent graph would be an increasing graph, right? It would look something like so. So it's reverse of tangent graphs. Positive tangent is increasing, and then positive cotangent is decreasing. Alright, let's take a look at an example. Y equals 2 cotangent of x over 3. So the first thing to think is the period is pi over b. My b value here is 1/3. So pi multiplied by the reciprocal, right? 3 over 1 would give you 3 pi. So period is 3 pi, meaning the increment is going to be 3 pi over 4. I don't have any phase shifts left and right or vertical shifts up and down. So I am just going to go ahead and make my 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 tick marks here. Y value of positive 2, y value of negative 2 here. I'm adding by 3 pi over 4 each time. So that's 3 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4, or 3 pi over 2, 9 pi over 4, and then 12 pi over 4, or 3 pi, right? So notice my period is 3 pi, right? From here to here is 3 pi long. Okay, let's go ahead and sketch the graph. Remember that the ends have the vertical asymptotes. I have my x-intercept in the center. And cotangent, positive cotangent is the decreasing graph. So I'm going to have a point there going up and then going down. So concave up to the left and concave down to the right. And that is my finished graph. Okay, here's another example. Y equals negative 1/4 tangent of x minus pi. So I find my period. Period is pi over b, and the b value is just 1, so it's just pi. And increment is going to be period divided by 4, so it's pi over 4. Notice that I have a right pi phase shift. So anytime I have a phase shift, I like to wait to put in my y-axis because I don't know where exactly it's going to go. It has to be between a negative and a positive value. So I'm going to go ahead and label that pi. So remember, this is like my new xy axis right here. So from the pi, I'm going to have 2 tick marks to the right and 2 tick marks to the left. That's how we do the tangent graph. And for each tick mark, right, I'm going to add an increment of pi over 4. So if I do pi plus pi over 4, right, because pi is really just 4 pi over 4, I get 5 pi over 4. And then if I add another pi over 4, I get 6 pi over 4, or 3 pi over 2. If I go to the left, right, if I go to the left of 4 pi over 4, I'm going to subtract a pi over 4, giving me 3 pi over 4. If I subtract another pi over 4, I get 2 pi over 4, or pi over 2. Remember, our ends have my vertical asymptote here. And let's see. 2 pi over 4 is still a positive value, so I'm going to go ahead and just stick my y-axis over here because I know it's to the left. Right, none of these are negative, so it wouldn't be between any two of our tick marks. And the a value that I have is 1/4, so I'm going to have positive 1/4 here and negative 1/4 here. I have a vertical shrink by 1/4. And in the center, right, my origin is my x-intercept. Normally, tangent graph is positive or increasing, but because I have a negative out in front, it's going to be a decreasing graph. So I go up to the 1/4 and down to the negative 1/4. Concave up to the left and concave down to the right. And there is my graph.